Thank you so much for turning on the recording. This is Leah Tate, and we are resuming the Board of Psychology meeting after lunch. It is 1 o'clock. Ms. Pertot, can you please call the roll?
Yes. Kasuga.
Here.
Cervantes.
Here.
Fu.
Aye.
Harb Sheets.
Here.
Nystrom. Phillips.
Here.
Riscate.
Here.
Rogers.
Here.
Tate.
Here.
Repeating Nystrom.
Ms. Nystrom, if you are speaking, you are on mute. Let's give her a few more seconds to attend. Ms. Nystrom?
Here.
Thank you. I knew you'd come in after a few seconds.
Thank you.
And before we move on, not a problem. We have a quorum. Before moving on to agenda item number 20, I understand that Ms. Hoganson has a comment that wasn't addressed before lunch. Ms. Hoganson?
Thank you very much. I just wanted to make sure that I understood the board's direction with regard to the pathways regulations on 19C. On section 1380.3, the definitions, in terms of, was it the board's pleasure that subsection D be licensee or licensed psychologist means a psychologist licensed by the board, and that we would add a new definition for E, registrant, meaning a registered psychological associate licensed by the board, and leaving trainee to address the concerns brought forward today, or did I misunderstand something?
I think you got it on the, I wanted to acknowledge your concern in referencing BPC code. And so under the one where you were talking about registered psychological, a psychological associate registered by the board under BPC code, and then, because I know you had some concern that we reference that code, if I understood correctly. Does that make sense?
Well, the only reason why I'm just wanting to understand is because as we've been reviewing these regulations, we've used the term licensee generically for both categories. So we will need to go through and make conforming changes to say licensee or registrant.
Yes. And then there was that one section that Dr. Winkleman had us look at that talked about the psychological associates being unlicensed. So we don't need to strike that part because we're looking at them as unlicensed, but registrants.
Correct. Yeah, they are technically, if they are registered, they are licensed by the board according to the Business and Professions Code. But if we change the definitions, they would neither be a licensee nor a licensed psychologist. So we could change unlicensed to not a licensee.
Would you be writing that in there, not a licensee?
Instead of the word unlicensed, yeah.
Yeah, but registered by the board. And then referencing the BPC code?
Well, we wouldn't need to reference the BPC code at that point because we'd be redefining in section 1380.3. We would define the licensee or licensed psychologist as a psychologist and a registrant as a registered psychological associate,
Okay.
if
And
that's
that-
what I understood your accommodation to mean.
And would that be inconsistent with BPC?
No, because the registrant is still licensed by the board according to the BPC, and the definition will reflect that. We would just not refer to them as a group. We would refer to them as two separate categories throughout.
Okay. Yeah. So that does reflect the conversation.
Okay, so we will have to make some conforming changes throughout, but that is consistent with the discussion. So I just wanted to make sure I understood that was what the board will
Yes.
was.
Yes. Yes. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you for clarifying.
And do we need any type of motion? Or are we okay to go on, Ms. Hoganson?
Well, the motion had been to make the changes reflective of the discussion today, so I think that covers it. So we're good.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
And we're moving on to agenda item number 20. And this is the consideration of public hearing testimony and written comments and responses and possible adoption of 16 CCR 1381.9, 1381.10, 1392 related to retired license, renewal of expired license, and psychologist fees. Mr. Glass-Steagall, please.
Good afternoon, board members. Included in your meeting materials under agenda item 20 is the consideration of public hearing testimony and written comments and responses and possible adoption of CCR section 1381.9, 81.10, and 1392. And this package is in the process because although SB 1193 gave the board statutory authority to issue a retired license, it did not specify the provisions needed, which is the need for regulations. So this package was noticed for the initial 45-day comment period on October 15th, 2021. The comment period for this rulemaking file ended on November 30th, 2021. One comment came in through the DCA complaint line, which is included in your memo. The regulatory hearing for this package took place on December 1st, 2021. And nobody appeared or submitted any comments for this package. So staff will compile the comments in the final statement of reasons and suggest that a single acknowledgement of the comment above will suffice. The action requested by staff is that the board consider the comments received and provide any feedback as deemed necessary and adopt the changes to the language for 16 TCR section 1381.9, 1381.10, and 1392. As it was noticed, delegate to the executive officer the authority to make any technical or non-substantive changes required by the control agencies as this regulation is finalized. And I'm available for any questions.
Does any board member have a question for Mr. Glass-Steagall?
This is Dr. Harb Sheets. On the, I can't remember in looking through, I saw that there's a $75 fee to apply for the retired license. Could you just walk us through what the fees are and the requirements? If, let's say I applied for a retired license, I paid the $75, and then 2 years down the road, I want to become active again. And what do I need to do? And the second part of that question is that $75, does that actually, is that reflective of what it costs us to process the retired license initially?
Happy to speak to that. Yeah, we, as part of the regulatory package, had to justify the fee of $75. So that is a reflective fee of the cost to review the application. As for the first question about whether or not somebody can come back, I believe Section C of 1381.10 says to apply to restore a license to active status if the application to place the license in retired status was granted less than 3 years prior, in addition to any other requirements in 2988.5 of the code, the licensee shall submit a form and then furnish a set of prints. After 3 years, the licensee would have to apply for a new license. Does that answer the question, Dr. Herbsheets? I'm sorry if I missed something.
Yes, it does. So, so if I were to have to, 4 years down the road, apply for a new license, I would would I have to take the EPPP again? And so I would start from the beginning.
Generally, you don't. I just received a message that my sound is fading. I am sorry about that. I'm not sure why.
Yeah.
The EPPP, generally not, but Ms. Chung can speak to this, I think, a little bit more. But the law and ethics exam, I think, is a general requirement to have to take when applying for a new license.
Okay, great. That clarifies it. Thank you so much, Mr. Glassbeagle.
My pleasure.
Any other board comment? Oh, I see. Dr. Cervantes.
Oops, sorry, folks. I was muted. I think my question was answered in Dr. Harbsheet's question, but let me just give clarification. So the form on page 93 of the combined packet is the form that someone would submit at the point of reinstating their license.
93 of the combined packet, I believe, is related to the applications under agenda item 19. The form for the regulatory package can be found on page. Sorry, I'm scrolling through the package. It starts on page 120, and that would be the application to request a retired status. And then 122 is to restore from retired status.
Oh, okay. Okay, thank you. Let me check that out real quick.
Any other board comment? Or the possibility of a motion, perhaps?
This is Dr. Harbsheets. I move that we accept the proposed language, including the forms and fees, and delegate to staff any other non-substantive changes as they may determine in developing the regulatory package. Does that cover it?
So this is your regulatory counsel again. Could, instead of the word approve, you use the word adopt?
Adopt, okay.
Yes, please. Thank you.
Sure. Okay. So I move that we adopt the regulatory package as presented to us, including the forms and the fees, and delegate to staff the task of making any non-substantive changes they determine necessary.
Second, this is Mr. Fu.
Did you second that, Mr. Fu? I didn't hear the beginning. I'm sorry.
Oh, yes, I apologize. That was me seconding, correct.
Perfect. Any other board comment before we move to public comment? Great. Ms. Moderator, can you please open public comment for agenda item number 20, please?
This is the moderator, and at the direction of the board, I have opened up the Q&A feature for public comment. Members of the public, if you would like to make a comment on this item, please click the Q&A icon located at the bottom right-hand corner of your WebEx screen. I'll go ahead and pause a moment to allow the public time to access the Q&A panel and submit their requests. All right, this is the moderator. Seeing no requests for public comment, would you like me to close the Q&A panel?
Yes, thank you very much. Before we vote on this issue, any other comments from the board? Seeing none, Ms. Pruto, can you please call the roll?
Kasuga,
Aye.
Cervantes,
Aye.
Fu,
Aye.
Harb-Sheets,
I,
Nystrom,
Aye.
Phillips,
Aye.
Riscate,
Aye.
Rogers,
Aye.
Tate.
Aye.
Thank you.
Perfect. Motion passes. Moving on to agenda item number 21. This is consideration of public hearing testimony and written comments and responses and possible adoption of 16 CCR 1392 concerning psychologist fees, California Psychology Law and Ethics examination, and initial license and biennial renewal fee. Mr. Glass-Steagall, please.
Thank you, Dr. Tate. Good afternoon again, board members. This is Jason Glass-Steagall, Central Services Manager. And included in your meeting materials is everything related to agenda item number 21. As is well known, fees at the Board of Psychology have not been increased since 1992, and we are a special fund entity, which means that funding is entirely by the licensees and disciplinary actions and assessments of the board. This board has historically maintained a healthy fund balance. However, increased operational costs, including enforcement-related costs, have increased in recent years, which has caused the board's fund to become structurally imbalanced with projected revenues less than expenditures. We are currently projected to become insolvent in fiscal year 23-24, which is July 1st, 2023. Additionally, the board is projected to expend its appropriation nearly fully in this current fiscal year and future years. As a result, we can no longer redirect resources from other program areas to fund these costs. The current proposal for this regulatory package is to bring our fees up to the statutory cap, while the board is looking at a internal fee study to determine the appropriate application and renewal fees for licensees. This package was noticed for the initial 45-day comment period on December 17th, 2021. The comment period for this rulemaking ended January 31st, 2022. 3 comments were received opposing a fee increase. They are attached for review and consideration. In summary, commenters questioned what the license recertification fee pays for, how the fee increase would benefit backlogs of applications for licensure, and why the board has not moved forward with joining the SIPAC. Further commenters declared that raising fees would unduly burden psychologists struggling with the current circumstances of living in California, obstruct clinicians from providing services, and lose competitiveness with coaching. The hearing for this agenda item took place yesterday, and the board received no comments at the hearing. Staff suggests that the fees proposed are necessary for the reasons publicized in the initial statement of reasons and discussed over the various board meetings over the last 5 or so years. Staff requests that the board consider the verbal, well, there were no verbal, but the written comments received prior to the hearing, and which was the 45-day comment period, provide feedback for responses as to whether the text should be modified in response to those comments and direct any requested modifications to the text, to staff to make the text. If no changes to the text are necessary, staff requests the board adopt 16 CCR section 1392, which is the regulatory text as it was noticed, delegate to the executive office for the authority to make any technical or non-substantive changes required by the control agencies as this regulation is finalized. Thank you, and I'm available for any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Glass-Steagall. Does any board member have any questions for Mr. Glass-Steagall? Oh, go ahead.
Oh, this is Dr. Harb-Sheets. Mr. Glass-Steagall, could you share with us how, as the costs have risen to the board, and since the board is self-supporting by the psychologists, how those increased costs have been, how they are passed on to the psychologists in any other way beyond raising fees? Like, that wasn't a good, I didn't phrase that right. You know, you mentioned in the enforcement area, would the cost recovery reflect the increased costs? But that without raising the fees to the statutory level, there's no other way to recoup the increased costs to the board. Is that correct?
That is, thank you for your question, Dr. Herbsheets. The cost recovery, while it does go into the board's fund as revenue, it is not a guaranteed number that can be utilized. So it's never a certain amount that we know we're going to collect. So to rely on that number would be very, very dangerous. We order more cost recovery than is collected every year. So that's not a number that we can rely on. Does that answer the question?
Yes, that's really helpful. I didn't realize that we don't collect all that we order. I didn't realize that. Thank you.
Mr. Glass-Steagall, if I may also just make an additional comment to your response, which is we don't collect it because sometimes it's outside of our control, where the what we ask for isn't going to be given to us by the administrative law judge in their proposed decision. In the proposed decision, the ALJ oftentimes will potentially reduce the cost paid back to the board for various reasons. So it's not that. That's an issue as well, on top of the dependency on cost recovery. Correct?
You are correct. And additionally, at times, cost recovery is ordered, but is only due once a licensee, say if it's a revoked license, that if the licensee or the previous licensee were to reapply for licensure, that the requirement to repay the cost recovery is once application is made to reapply for license. So that is cost recovery ordered that we are unable to collect until that, if it ever happens.
Any other comments or questions for Mr. Glass-Steagall? Would anyone like to venture and make a motion before we go to public comment?
Dr. Tate, this is Sayron, and I'm happy to make the motion. Before I make the motion, though, I just want to clarify that, do we need to make a determination that we've received the responses as written and that no modifications will be made? Is that a first step, or can we just go straight to the motion?
Oh, Ms. Bond?
Or if you're regulatory counsel, Heather Hoganson, I can chime in. The
Oh,
motion could
thank
be
you.
to not make any changes to the text in response to the comment, to accept the proposed responses from staff, and to adopt section 1392 and 1392.1.
I will. I affiliate myself with the language that our regulatory counsel has provided us and make that motion. And I'll also make the addendum that we delegate to the executive office the authority to make any technical and non-substantive changes required by control agencies as this regulation is being finalized.
I second. This is Dr. Kasuga.
Perfect. Thank you. Any more board comment before we shift to public comment? Ms. Moderator, can you please open public comment for agenda item number 21?
This is the moderator, and at the direction of the board, I have opened up the Q&A feature for public comment. Members of the public, if you would like to make a comment on this item, please click that Q&A icon located at the bottom right-hand corner of your WebEx screen. I'll go ahead and pause a moment to allow the public time to access the Q&A panel and submit their requests. This is the moderator. Seeing no requests for comment, would you like me to close that Q&A panel?
Yes, and thank you very much. Okay, last moment for board members to make any comment. I do not see any hands up. Ms. Pruteau, can you please call the roll?
Kasuga.
Aye.
Cervantes.
Aye.
Pu.
Aye.
Harb Sheets.
Aye.
Nystrom.
Aye.
Phillips.
Aye.
Riscate.
Aye.
Rogers.
Aye.
Tate.
Aye.
Thank you.
Thank you. That motion passes. And we move on to agenda item number 22. This is the Legislative and Regulatory Committee update. The chairperson of that committee is Dr. Cervantes. And Dr. Cervantes, you have the floor.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. The legislative and regulatory updates begin on page 147 of the combined packet. And the first item we'll be discussing is item 22A, which is for information purposes only. Ms. Costa? Is she with us?
Good afternoon, everyone.
Thank you.
I'm here to present item 22A, which includes a list of two-year bills, which are bills that we either watched or took positions on in the 2021 legislative year. Some of these bills are officially dead and will not move forward in the legislative process. If you look at the status bar, that will help you determine where those bills are located. For our sponsor bill, SB 401, it is in the Assembly and Business Professions Committee. We anticipate that the bill will be heard sometime in April. Additionally, Ms. Sorick sent technical amendments for SB 401 to the bill's staff member. These technical amendments reflect existing language from SB 801, namely removing gendered language and referencing registered psychological associates instead of psychological assistants. Additionally, in the hand carry, you will find the 2022 legislative deadline calendar. One deadline of note is actually happening today, February 18th, which is the bill introduction deadline. When the board fully convenes again in April, there will be more bills to discuss. That concludes my remarks for this item. Please let me know if you have any questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there any board comment on item 22A? Seeing none, could we open public comment?
This is the moderator, and at the direction of the board, I've opened up the Q&A feature for public comment. Members of the public, if you would like to make a comment on this item, please click that Q&A icon located at the bottom right-hand corner of your WebEx screen. I'll go ahead and pause a moment to allow the public time to access the Q&A panel and submit their requests. And just as a reminder for members who are call-in audio only, you can indicate that you would like to make a public comment by clicking *3 on your device to raise your hand.
Is there any public comment? I can't see from my end.
No worries. This is the moderator. It looks like there's no requests for public comment. Would you like me to close that Q&A panel?
Yes, please. Thank you.
All right.
Okay. Moving on to the next item. Item 22B is legislative items for future meetings. Staff and members of the board, is there any legislative items you would like to discuss at future meetings?
Hi, this is Antoinette. I just wanted to say that we have the California Psychological Association's testing technicians bill that we have been providing some technical assistance on the language. So that will be placed on the Legislative and Regulatory Affairs Committee agenda, as well as the AB 1733. Which extends the Bagley-Keene open meetings waiver provisions that the board has been operating under to allow for remote meetings. So those two bills, we will make sure that that is on the Legislative and Regulatory Affairs Committee agenda and then be presented to the board at the April 29th meeting.
Thank you. Is there any board comment on future legislative items? Seeing none, could we open public comment?
This is the moderator, and at the direction of the board, I've opened up the Q&A feature for public comment. Members of the public, if you would like to make a comment on this item, please click that Q&A icon located at the bottom right-hand corner of your WebEx screen. I'll pause a moment to allow the public time to access the Q&A panel and submit their requests. All right, seeing none, would you like me to close that Q&A panel? Oh,
Yes,
I apologize.
please.
We do actually have one
we have
request.
Okay.
One moment from Dr. Melody Schaefer. I'll request to unmute your microphone. Please click the unmute me button when the prompt appears.
Thank you. I was attempting to type the entire question there. But my question is regarding a bill for extending online supervision, telesupervision. Is that something the board will be undertaking at future meetings?
That's an interesting question. Mr. Glass-Steagall? Miss Thorick?
So earlier in the day, the board reviewed and approved language to change the regulations to allow for the real-time supervision, which would extend essentially the policy of the waiver that the board has been operating under. There is no legislative proposal at this time for that provision to extend. But we spoke yesterday briefly about if the emergency declaration is continued, the board would have the authority to extend the current board waiver that's been put in place until the end of March to extend for another 6 months or until the end of the declared emergency, whichever occurred first. So that was something that was relayed yesterday, and I'm not sure if you might not have been on during that part of the discussion, but I just wanted to clarify that yes, the board is now moving forward with a regulatory change which would put in policy the telesupervision allowance, and then through the declared emergency, we could continue the waiver with that authority from the emergency. I hope that answers your question.
I think in part, and thank you, Ms. Sork, is part of what is intended to happen to make this permanent so that, in other words, beyond the COVID issue that gives authority for extension or seeking authority for extension beyond that given through DCA, is there any work to make telepsychology or telesupervision permanently acceptable within the regulations?
Dr. Schaefer, I think when we were going to the wording, proposed wording on pathways, we did have that wording in there that
Okay,
allows
great.
for real time, but it has to go through the regulatory process. And maybe Mr. Glassbeagle or Ms. Sorek could give us some idea, if that's even possible, of how long that might take.
Thank you.
This,
Go ahead.
no, you first, please.
I'm Dr. Schaefer. I'm reading into your question that maybe you have some concern that there may be a gap that's not covered, like a time frame that's not covered, and you'd probably like some clarity on that.
Well, that wasn't my point, but yes, that would be a concern separate to what I stated, that as you know, over the past year and a half, we have come to the very 11th hour, so to speak, or beyond, to find out through the powers that be of extensions given to this. And as you know, for clinical supervisors, to find at the last moment gives them very little time to scramble and prepare. So yes, that's always been an issue throughout this time that we've gone through the pandemic. But in addition to that, many, as you know, would be very favorable to have it as a permanent approved method by which to provide supervision, to do it distally through HIPAA-compliant telehealth platforms. So that's more my concern is that being pushed along, or does, as was just stated, does Ms. Sorek or others have any sense as to what the timeline may be for that?
Okay, I'll let Mr. Glass-Steagall. Is he still with
I'll
us?
go ahead and take this one. So I think those of you who are on the call today have seen some regulatory updates at our board meetings, and things tend to take some time. First we need to draft the regulatory package. And then when I say draft the package, that means not only the language that you approve at the board or committee level, but also the initial statement of reasons, which explains section by section why each section change was made, and fully articulate that, and then notice that to the public. We have an internal review that goes through department, agency, and Department of Finance, and then it goes out for the formal rulemaking. I like to give the public a heads up that this process can take anywhere between 2 and 3 years, and as much as that's hard to say, I want to be as transparent in the spirit of this board as possible. And I also want to keep in mind that the board has established legislative priorities, working with Pan's office on the professional, on the egregious sexual behavior change. We have fee changes in legislation, and then we have the patient privilege legislation that we've committed to. So all that being said, we will continue to work with our with the declared emergency as long as we have that authority to remove any unnecessary barriers to telesupervision, and then proceed with making a long-term change in regulation. Now, if somebody else wanted to do legislation to address that issue, that is certainly something perhaps Dr. Schaefer's division could find an author, and that's another option as well, and something the board could consider, being in support of, since they are seeking that change in regulation. So I just wanted to throw that out there as well.
Well, that would be a wonderful arrangement, a happy marriage, if you will. I know that CPA is concerned, interested in helping in this direction as well. And I'm on the Leadership and Advocacy Network as one of the members. So I will bring it to them, and perhaps there's a way to work collectively, since I certainly understand from the time I've been coming to the meetings how the board is very exceptionally busy continually with not always enough personnel at hand. So I know you mentioned this last time, Ms. Sorick, about 2 to 3 years. When I brought that to my alleged constituencies, they were wondering, is there any way that could be fast tracked, or does it really have to take that long? But of course, most people aren't involved in passing legislation, so they don't understand the process is laborious, even if it's fast tracked. So if you're amenable to that, I'll bring that to the Leadership and Advocacy Network and see if there's some way to work collectively. And maybe that would, many hands make light work, so to speak, and maybe that would be facilitative in some way. Thank you.
So,
Appreciate it.
Ms. Sorick, could you, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Oh, Ms. Sorick, could you clarify for us the wording that we talked about before lunch in the Pathways to Licensure that expands the supervision methods available, that seems to indicate that it uses the word remote supervision. Would that allow for the remote supervision as we have been able to utilize during the pandemic, under the declared emergency? And if that's the case, then are you saying that going a legislative route might be quicker than following the pathways regulatory changes through?
So in answer to your first question, Dr. Harpsheets, yes. The wording that the board approved today would allow for a continuance of the interpretation of telesupervision in policy from this point forward once that becomes effective. Now, the regulatory process, as I mentioned, I like to put it out there that it's been my experience with this initial review process that it takes between 2 to 3 years. Now, I say that also understanding that not only do we have a list of legislative priorities, but we also have a list of regulatory priorities that we need to get through, and we've been going in order of when they've been approved by the board. So we still have disciplinary guidelines, regulations to write. We also have inactive psychological associate regulations that we need to write. And then pathways will be next. And we were waiting on the statutory changes through our sunset before we started that package. So as far as the order of regulations, that's kind of the order of things in the future. Legislation takes typically a year to go through the process, unless it's a 2-year cycle and your bill gets caught up, like our SB 401 got caught up this last time around, and it has taken 2 years. Then it becomes effective January 1, or if there's an urgency clause upon signature. So conceivably, the legislative process would be quicker than the regulatory process. So that's just kind of the reality of that situation.
Oh, thank you. I just wanted to make sure that, in a sense, this request that Dr. Schaefer is making is already in the process, but going through the regulatory process. And there's no guarantee if the efforts are made, say, on behalf of CPA, or CPA made efforts to get it through the legislative process, there's no guarantee it's going to come through any quicker, correct?
There is never a guarantee, certainly, especially if it gets caught in the process. But let's say something was introduced this year there's a possibility it could become effective January 1, 2023.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Thank you. And just for reference, Dr. Schaefer, the language that we approved today is on page 50. It was for item 19C, and it was on page 53 of our combined packet. I just want to reference that for you if you want to take a
Yes,
look at what we
thank you.
approved for the purposes of regulatory change.
Yes, thank you. I appreciate that. I wasn't sure if that was the same as what had been discussed previously at a board meeting. I was under the assumption that there was going to be separate legislative action, but if it's subsumed under the verbiage that we reviewed with Dr. Sheets' presentation, then, and if that is the venue by which this would be processed and move forward, that's great. I think CPA folks from CPA are waiting to probably comment as well on what is going on at CPA, but maybe I'm mistaken. Is the public comment? They're asking me on text if the public comment is still open.
Is there any other public comment? I was asking.
Yes, this is the moderator. I do have a couple individuals who have requested public comment. First, we have Dr. Winkleman. And Dr. Winkleman, I will request to unmute your microphone. Please click the unmute me button when the prompt appears on your device.
And I just want to, as a point of information, we are on item 22B, legislative items for future meeting, as far as our agenda. Go ahead, Ms. Winkleman.
Hi, thank you. It's Dr. Elizabeth Winkleman from the California Psychological Association again. I appreciate that the psychological testing technician bill will be on the agenda for the next meeting. And we also have Dr. Jo Lindercrow on the line, so I'm going to ask to turn it to her regarding the status of proposed legislation for making remote supervision permanent, because our understanding is that would be faster than the regulatory change.
Elizabeth. Hi, Dr. Jo Lindercrow with the California Psychological Association. We, in fact, do plan on introducing 2 bills this year. And today is today's the bill deadline, but we do already have draft language, and we do have authors for both the technician bill and also for a bill that would make remote supervision permanent. So we're certainly hoping that the Board of Psychology would consider that bill and when you're looking at your positions. As soon as we have draft language, but of course it's not final language right now. So you can anticipate that coming as soon as possible.
Okay, thank you. Any other public comment?
This is the moderator. Looks like there are no further requests for public comment. Would you like me to close that Q&A panel?
Yes, thank you. Okay, so moving to our next item, and I just want to thank all the public comment and our staff for being prepared to answer questions. Thank you so much. Item 22C is the regulatory update, which begins on page 155 of the combined packet. As a reminder, these are items that were previously considered and approved by the board. Mr. Glass-Steagall.
Thank you very much. Included in your meeting materials under agenda item 22C is the regulatory update. This is the status of all regulatory packages. The board is currently in the process of moving forward. This does not include the 2 packages that were dealt with today, the retired status and the fee package, because those were separate outside of this agenda item. Of note on this agenda item, I want to speak to number 2, which is the continuing professional development regulatory package. And as an update, staff is working with the Office of Administrative Law to change the effective date of this package to be in 2023. As such, we will be doing a 15-day notice before the April meeting in hopes to complete the full review by June, which would give us a few months to do outreach and education on a 2023 implementation date. And I'm happy to answer any questions on this or any of the other packages in there.
Thank you. Is there any questions or comments from the board members? Seeing none, could we open public comment?
This is the moderator, and at the direction of the board, I have opened up the Q&A feature for public comment. Members of the public, if you would like to make a comment, please click that Q&A icon located at the bottom right-hand corner of your WebEx screen. All right, looks like we have a request for comment from Dr. Winkleman.
Okay.
Hi, Elizabeth Winkleman again from CPA. I was wondering, Mr. Glass-Steagall, I thank you for the update, and I'm wondering if you could clarify when the implementation date for the continuing professional development would be official. Like, at what point in time would it be certain so that we can inform our members? There have been a lot of questions, as you know, over the years as to when that is going to be implemented, and we want to let people know as soon as possible after the implementation date is formally approved.
Happy to respond to that, but I think Ms. Hoganson can do a bit of a better job than myself.
Thank you. Heather Hoganson, your regulatory counsel here. The idea with having the Office of Administrative Law sort of work through this and have our 15-day period, it will go to the board. It depends on if there are any comments on that 15-day, because it was a public comment period, and if additional changes are necessitated from that. I would note that the 15-day comment period is narrowed to just those things being changed. So it's not the entire package being back up for debate, but just those changes, which would be the effective dates most likely. And we are building in a transition period that, to keep the same intent from the way the regulations was first passed from the board. So we are trying to maintain that intent, and it's just going to depend on what we hear back from the Office of Administrative Law.
Thank you very much. So what would be the soonest possible, at what point? Is it the board's approval after the 15-day comment period? So at what point in the process does it become certain, and when would be the soonest if there are no further changes due to the 15-day comment period?
Well, I suppose after if there were no additional comment periods after the 15-day, the board could approve it at a meeting. Then it would go back to the Office of Administrative Law. They do have quarterly effective dates, so it kind of depends on when they approve it. But the idea would be that there would be a few months before it went into effect, to give people more time to transition and to give the board time to conduct outreach. I realize that's kind of a vague answer, but without having the dates from the Office of Administrative Law first, I can't really estimate the time frame.
Ms. Hoganson,
Would
the date not be, let's see, would the date be sometime January 1, 2023 or later, and not prior to January 1, 2023?
Right. The ask for the Office of Administrative Law would be to change the regulations to make that effective date, that January 1, 2023 date, and then have the regulation approved beforehand so that everyone knows going forward what's coming up. So even if the regulation was approved before, the effective date in the text would direct people of when to start.
Thanks.
And
That clarifies.
and so even if it was approved before that date, if it was too narrow, that date might be pushed back. The January 2023 date.
Oh goodness, if we're still dealing with it by that time, the idea would be that the date in the regulation that goes out to public comment would be the effective date.
Oh, at that point when it goes out to public comment. Okay.
Mhm.
I understand. Thank you. Is there any other public comment on this regulatory update?
Yes, we have 2 individuals. We'll go in the order comments received. So Jolinder Crow, I'll request to unmute your microphone.
Hi, thank you. Not to beat a dead horse, but just because we're trying to really understand this so we can communicate it effectively. And this has taken a really long time, as all of you are painfully aware. So can you say when, and maybe Mr. Glass-Steagall, maybe you said this and I missed it. When is this going out for public comment?
We are waiting to hear back from the Office of Administrative Law as they currently have the package. So it's hard to say for sure, but it should be before the April board meeting. So that way the final package can come back to the board at the April board meeting.
Okay, so you're anticipating that at the April board meeting, you would have it back and then it would go out for public comment. Is that right? I'm just trying to get the timeline straight.
No, I'm sorry if I wasn't clear. The April, we anticipate sometime in March to receive the package back from the Office of Administrative Law.
Oh, okay.
When we receive it back, we can then go out for 15-day notice.
Okay.
We want the 15-day notice and the comment period to be done, so that way the board at the April meeting can consider any comments made.
Got it.
And can tell us to move the package forward again.
Okay. And then at the April board meeting, you'll consider any comments, then it goes, let's say there are no comments, or let's say, well, whatever, you have a few comments. The board will make a decision, then it has to go back to administrative law?
Yeah, it will probably have to go back to DCA, I'm assuming, for a quick review, but Ms. Hoganson, I can speak to that. But ultimately, it has to go back to the Office of Administrative Law to be approved.
And then what happens?
And then it's approved and it becomes effective on whatever, whether it's like a quarterly effective date or a January 1, 2023 effective date. But the language is all there anyway, and we can start campaigning and
right. But it's not going to go into effect before January 1st, 2023, is it?
It will not.
It will not. And so that would be April and then back to DCA and back to OAL. So April, May, June, July. So it could be like in the fall by the time it's finally approved. So we would have about maybe 3 months to get people ready. Is there any way to start educating people? I mean, is there any way that we can get started earlier than that, or does it really just need to wait until it's finally approved? I mean, we've done some walkthroughs and that kind of thing, but we're just trying to kind of anticipate, when we can really say, okay, this is going to go into effect in January. So let's talk about what it means.
If I may, Dr.
right?
Cervantes, just say a quick word.
Yes.
I understand that this has been a very long
Yes.
and frustrating process. And I understand that people are just trying to be ahead of the game and they want to be able to get the right continuing professional development or CE or whatever the board is accepting for purposes of renewal compliance. And at the same time that we've been waiting and going through this painful process, we've also been developing educational materials. So we have an
Okay.
advisory that we've been working on that we'll be ready to go with. The hope and the goal is that as much lead time as we have for the effective date and the implementation date, or when it's approved, when it becomes effective, and when that straddle year starts,
Mhm.
we will communicate and convey that as quickly as we can. What I hesitate to do is put anything out right now because
Sure.
it's not approved. We don't know. We can assume that, there aren't any major issues with the package, but we never want to assume that something's going to get approved and start telling people how to prepare for it before it's been approved. So I understand your frustration and, I think we're all equally just waiting patiently with bated breath for
Right.
these dates to line up.
Yeah.
And
And let me be clear, I'm not so frustrated anymore because this has been years in the making. I'm more just interested in our being able to help the board by giving as accurate information as we can. So I think all we want to do is reflect what you can say and when. So we'll just wait for your direction on that, and happy to work with you.
Correct me if I'm wrong, Ms. Hoganson, but is it safe to say that that CPD will not happen in 2022? The earliest it will happen is 2023, and as soon as more information is ready, we can get that out to everybody. Is that a safe statement?
Yes, the proposed 15-day comment period would have an effective date in the regulation of January 2023. So even if they were approved by the Office of Administrative Law tomorrow, it would not go into effect until January 1.
Right. Okay. Well, we'll keep waiting
Thank
along
you.
with you. Thank you.
And then do we have one more person?
This is the moderator. Yes, Dr. Marilyn Emus.
Okay, go ahead.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, this is Dr. Marilyn Imos from the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation. We too have been waiting excitedly on the specifics of the CPD. As you know, we have quite a large organization and employ a large number, hundreds of psychologists at CDCR. And I've received quite a few questions, also specific questions that I can't answer. Obviously, I have copy of the proposed regulations, and I've studied those, and I've made tables and charts, but I'm struggling. And I was wondering if there would be a way that I could receive maybe some help with this, because in addition to the information you put together, some of the things I'm going to have to tailor to our psychologist audience at CDCR. Do you have any suggestions for me?
Thank you. Ms. Thorick, how do we provide technical support on regulatory implementation?
Since this is, and especially because this is a sister agency request, I would suggest, Dr. Emus, that you send to Ms. McCochran whatever materials you have. And then once the or conceivably, once the regulation becomes effective,
Mhm.
or if we know that approval is happening, then we can take a look and make sure that whatever guidance you're giving works with the guidance we're giving.
That would
On
be
top
great.
of that, if there are any questions that you're getting, our plan is to, and we've done this with CPA and our telehealth regulations, if there are frequently asked questions that you're getting, at least a month in, we'd like to kind of compile those and put an FAQ out on our website about the regulations, because it's one thing for us to say, this is the regulations, this is what it does. And I think it's another thing that once it goes out and it's actual law and we're getting calls about, well, what about this? What about that? Then we can formulate a frequently asked questions that's hopefully useful to the people on the receiving end.
I appreciate that. I had forgotten that. I've actually been asked by you in the past to make a list of those, and I have provided somebody, I think it was somebody else though, at that point, a few years ago. So I'd be very happy to do that.
Perfect.
Thank you.
I think that, as time goes on, and do you, what types of help are you going to have? Are you going to have uh, a wizard or videos, or have you decided what types of assistance you'll have on your website? Just so I'm kind of prepared.
So um, today or right now on this item, we are just doing the regulatory update.
Mhm.
But could we, if we're going to, I'm going to ask if we're going to discuss to bring this back to our next board meeting in more detail. Could we discuss those types of supports at that time?
Sounds great. Yes.
Is that appropriate, Ms. Orick?
Absolutely. We can do some bullets on what our implementation plan is, and hopefully that informs the discussion from today.
That would be wonderful. And I'll continue to just collect the questions and continue the research, but I'll probably have quite a list for you at some point.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Is that all for public comment?
We do have some additional comments from Dr. Winkleman and Dr. Schaefer, so I will unmute Dr. Winkleman first.
Hi. I
Go
just
ahead.
have one quick follow-up question, which is regarding the implementation. So some people, some psychologists are eager to start getting the continuing professional development that's not coming under the traditional CE. And I think part of the anxiety some people are having about the implementation date is, in fact, when you renew your license, it looks back 2 years. So you're providing documentation of continuing education you've received in the prior 2 years. I'm well aware there's a 1-year transitional period, so everyone will certainly be able to comply. And I just wanted to confirm that there would not be able to obtain, if people engage in some activities such as a peer supervision, prior to the effective date, let's say it's January 2023, but within the time period for their next renewal, that would not be possible, correct? Sorry, let me try to say this more clearly. There's no way to earn these new categories of continuing professional development prior to the actual effective date of the regulations. Is that correct?
Who would like to help clarify this? Is that
I'll start on this, and Ms. Hoganson, if you can fill any gaps that I might have left open. I would say it's inadvisable to encourage folks to do any of the CPD activities in that 9-hour category that's not traditional continuing education. really until the law changes, it's best not to encourage folks to plan for that, to submit for their renewal. Now, if people want to do peer review or practice outcome monitoring now, they can do that on their own. It's just they may or may not be able to submit that for compliance for renewal purposes. So I hesitate to encourage people to do anything that's in the CPD model that's different from traditional CE until we know the status of the regs being approved. Ms. Hoganson?
Which is consistent with what we've been saying in this discussion. Ms. Hoganson?
Yes, I would only add that it won't technically exist as an option until the effective date. So if one chose to do it on the outside, it would be, you know, an extracurricular activity and not count for regulatory purposes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That answers. Thank you. Public comment, is there any others? I just can't see it on my little window here.
This is the moderator. Yes, it looks like we have another request from Dr. Schaefer.
Okay.
Thank you. For the intent of clarity and to reduce angst in those that will be asking me these questions, with the 1 year kind of ramping up after approval when it becomes active. So a case in point might be, if I'm understanding you correctly, that if it was approved and becomes live, so to speak, January 1st, 2023, and someone has their renewal date as June of 2023, they would not be held to the new regulations that they will have to have accrued all the various hours within the different categories necessary by that date, because that's still the first year ramp up. Is that correct?
Hi, this is Lizelma Cochran, the CE and Renewals Coordinator. And yes, Dr. Schaefer, you are correct. If in that 1 year straddle or in that straddle year, licensees will be able to use either a combination of CPD and CE, or they could have done the current model, which is just CE, or do fully CPD.
Yes, and
during
then
that straddle year.
And then once January 1st, just to use the same timeline, January 1st of 2024 would arrive, then that would necessitate that anyone going for relicensure would need to comply fully with the regulations as written.
Correct.
Thank you. I appreciate that. That helps make it clear of how I can communicate that in a way that hopefully will reduce a lot of the questions that we're bringing up. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there any other public comment?
Yes, we have another request from Joe Linder Crow.
Okay, certainly.
Hi, just this again. Because I think it's really important that we're all singing from the same songbook here. And going back to Ms. Sorik's comments about, to Dr. Winkleman's question about accruing credits under the new system. I think my understanding has been, and I've confirmed this several times, and then I think your counsel has clarified this, but I think we should just be straight out with people. It would seem to me that no one should be counting on accruing any hours under the new system until it is officially in effect. And I think it would be really helpful for us to really get very, very clear on that, so that people aren't depending on, yes, they want to be able to use these other things, but the fact is, as I understand it, that it will not count if they have accrued it prior to the effective date. And I just want to confirm that one more time so we're all really straight.
Yes, yes. So
Thank you.
If it before the implementation date, please continue to use the current CE model and do not change anything until the implementation date.
Great. Thank you for that
So
clarity.
nothing
Thank you,
you
Ms.
do,
McCochran.
right?
Thank you.
So nothing you do before, or nothing a psychologist does before the implementation date will be counted towards their renewal.
These new categories, correct.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
As stated earlier, at that point of when we finally approve the regulations after the public comment period, we will also have some discussion about implementation. So I know we don't have all the answers today, but I hope that gives you some anticipation about when there may be answers on these issues of implementation. Any other public comment on this regulatory update?
This is the moderator. Appears there are no further requests for public comment. Would you like me to close that Q&A panel?
Yes, thank you everyone for the questions. I think it gives us all a lot to think about as we consider the next phase of this particular regulatory package. And I just lost my file. Haha, here it is. Before I conclude my report, Dr. Tate, I just want to add that the Legislative and Regulatory Affairs Committee will meet this year on Friday, March 25th and Friday, June 10th. And right now those are meetings planned virtually. And there should have been, or there may have been, a legislative calendar in the hand carry packet for the board members. As Ms. Costa mentioned, there was a big deadline today, a big legislative deadline today. And so you could anticipate that at our April meeting, we'll have more to report. This concludes my report, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Cervantes, for your attention to detail and careful consideration of all of your items. We are going to move to agenda item number 23, and this is the Enforcement Unit Report. And that report will be provided by Mr. Burke.
Good afternoon, President Tate, Vice President Fu, board members. I'll be presenting the enforcement report. It's agenda item 23, and that's on page 155 of the combined materials. On February the 1st, 2022, the enforcement unit filled its vacant AGPA, the enforcement analyst. The new hire is responsible for gathering statistical data, performing desk investigations, and referring cases to the Division of Investigation and the Office of Attorney General. The enforcement unit is now fully staffed and has no vacancies. The complaint program, since July 1st, 2021, the board has received 531 complaints. All complaints received are opened and assigned to an analyst. The citation program, since July 1st, 2021, the board has issued 15 enforcement citations. Discipline program, the board has referred 18 cases to the Office of the Attorney General. The probation program, enforcement staff is currently monitoring 46 active probationers, 17 told probationers. Of the 46 active probationers, 1 is out of compliance. The report includes a number of attachments. There's an overview of enforcement activity in the combined package and the performance measures, which can be found on page 23 of the hand carry materials. This item is for informational purposes only. Thank you very much.
Does anyone have any questions for Mr. Burke at this time? I don't see any hands. Oh, Dr. Cervantes, there you are.
I know, good job pinch hitting for Ms. Monterrubio, but I just wanted to say that I really appreciate this, some changes to the format of this report. I do think it better conveys the hard work of the enforcement unit. And so I just wanted to say that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll relay that to the enforcement unit.
Perfect. Any other board comment at this time? Ms. Moderator, can you please open public comment?
This is the moderator, and at the direction of the board, I have opened up the Q&A feature for public comment. Members of the public, if you would like to make a comment on this item, please click that Q&A icon located at the bottom right-hand corner of your WebEx screen. I'll pause a moment to allow the public time to access the Q&A panel and submit their requests. All right, seeing none, would you like me to close that Q&A panel?
Yes, please.
All right.
And thank
and
you.
it looks like I see a hand raised from Board Member Phillips.
Oh, it went.
Excuse me,
Member
I don't know
Phillips, do you have
I don't know
something?
what's going on. I thought I had X'd it out, but it seems to just stay up on the screen, so I apologize.
Not a problem. Any other board comment before we move on? Perfect. So we are going to be moving on to agenda item number 24. Prior to that, though, let's take looks like a 9-minute break till 2:30 so everyone can get things together. And we will come back at 2:30 for agenda item number 24. Thank you. Thank you for making sure recording is going. This is Leah Tate, and it is continuing in the afternoon for the Board of Psychology meeting. Ms. Pruteau, can you please call the roll?
Yes. Kasuga.
Here.
Cervantes.
Here.
Fu.
Aye.
Harbsheets.
Here.
Nystrom.
Here.
Phillips.
Here.
Riscate.
Here.
Rogers.
Here.
Tate.
Here.
Thank you.
Everyone is back. Thank you to everyone for being so prompt. We are going to take up agenda item number 24, the Enforcement Committee report in consideration of and possible action on committee recommendations. Dr. Phillips is the chairperson of this committee. Dr. Phillips, please. If you're speaking, you're on mute.
Gosh, that was so eloquent. Good afternoon, everybody. As has already been indicated, Ms. Monterrubio was not able to join us today. So we are going to be going through some materials that we've been going through for several months on the Enforcement Committee. In fact, I think more than a couple of years. And basically what those materials relate to is an attempt to overhaul and to make more uniform and consistent the enforcement statutes and regulations. As with many things we've gone through in this last several years, there have been an aggregation of statutes and regulations across time, many of which were not drafted consistently with each other. And as a result, it became difficult for, certainly for consumers to read, for licensees or registrants to read, or for that matter, for us to read as board members or board staff. So we've done a pretty comprehensive overhaul. It's been a pretty major undertaking. In all likelihood, we're only going to be talking about the statutory material today, which is the beginning of agenda item number 24. So it's a statutory update, report, and consideration of and possible action on committee recommendations. So based on prior discussion with staff, I think the best way for me to approach this is as follows. I'm going to go through, the committee has discussed all of these sections, obviously made substantial revisions with the aid of staff. I'm going to go through and mention each section number to the extent that a board member has a comment with regard to that particular item, then they should let me know that. Otherwise, we'll be moving through them fairly quickly. There are certain sections that staff was instructed to and did make some slight modifications after the last enforcement committee meeting. So those particular items we're going to stop. Mr. Burke has been kind enough to agree to read out those particular sections so that they can be given greater consideration both by the enforcement committee members and the board as a whole. So hopefully that procedure is understandable to you all. It'll become understandable in the first few minutes, if not. The first section is section 2902. Are there any questions that board members have with regard to section, questions or comments in section 2902?
Yeah, this is Dr. Harbsheets. In 2902C, that wording is the same wording that we had in pathways that we ended up changing. And I wonder if we should make sure that they're consistent.
I think that would make the most sense, certainly. So perhaps we can rely on board counsel in conjunction with a regulatory counsel to bring those two into conformity with each other.
Yeah, thank you.
Sure. I knew we were going to run into that right off the bat, but it's not a surprise. We do try to be consistent in our regulations. Are there any other comments on section 2902? And there will be time for public comment at a later point. Let's move on to the next section, which would be try to flip back and forth through my documents, the documents that you're looking at. So we're looking at 2903. Again, there's been no substantive changes since the enforcement committee meeting, but there may be comments or questions from the board members. Any comments or questions by board members? Seeing none, we're going to move on to section 2908. It's a fairly minor modification of the existing statutory section. Any questions or comments from board members? Hearing and seeing none, we'll move on to the next section. I have to look at my document because it's got sections that are highlighted. So we've been through section 2908. We're going to section 2912. Actually, this is one section that I would like to ask Mr. Burke to read out for us.
Section 2912. Nothing in this chapter shall be construed to restrict or prevent a person with a current and active license as a psychologist at the doctoral level in another state or territory of the United States or in Canada from offering psychological services in this state for no more than 30 days, consecutive or non-consecutive, in any calendar year. Practice for any part of a day is considered a full day for the purposes of this section. This section does not apply to either a licensee with an inactive or suspended license or an individual whose license has been revoked or denied by or surrendered to the board.
Now, this is a statutory section that we had previously sought, I think, it to have included in sunset, if I recall correctly. Is that right, Ms. Sork?
That's correct.
And it was not included. It was considered too substantive a change. So we've revisited this section. Do any board members have any questions or concerns about section 2912, including Mr. Fu? Hearing and seeing none. Let's go next to section 2934.1. Are there any questions or comments from board members? Again, seeing none, we'll move on to the succeeding section, which is 2936. Any questions or comments from the board? Okay. And next section is 2960.05, which I will ask Mr. Burke to read out.
2960.05 A. Except as provided in Subdivision B, any accusation filed against a licensee pursuant to Section 11503 of the Government Code shall be filed within 5 years from the date the Board initiates an investigation of the alleged act or omission that is the basis for disciplinary action, or within 7 years from the date the alleged act or omission that is the basis for disciplinary action occurred, whichever occurs first. B. Exceptions to the limitations in Subdivision A are as follows. 1. An accusation filed against a licensee pursuant to Section 11503 of the Government Code alleging the procurement of a license by fraud or misrepresentation is not subject to the limitations set forth in Subdivision A. 2. An accusation filed against a licensee pursuant to Section 11503 of the Government Code alleging sexual misconduct shall be filed within 10 years after the alleged act or omission occurred. C. Instances in which any limitation period referenced in this section is told. 1. If an alleged act or omission that is the basis for disciplinary action involves a minor, any limitation period referenced in this section is told until the minor reaches the age of majority pursuant to Section 6502 of the Family Code. 2. If a licensee fails to file a report with the Board pursuant to Article 11, commencing with Section 800 of Chapter 1, any limitation period referenced in this section is told until the licensee complies with reporting requirements. 3. If material evidence necessary for prosecuting or determining whether a disciplinary action would be appropriate is unavailable to the Board due to an ongoing criminal investigation, then any limitation period referenced in this section is told until such evidence is available to the Board.
Thank you. Are there any comments from board members on this particular section? So this is basically the statute of limitations for when we can bring, from within which we have to act once we have knowledge or of a particular violation, or once or from the date that the acts occurred.
Dr. Phillips,
Yes.
I have a comment, and it's on the previous section, section 2936. Is that okay?
Okay, sure. Let's back up.
And it's actually with regards to the notice.
Right.
So it's not the first part, but like the 15 to 27 part. And to help consumers receiving appropriate psychological services, all licensees shall post in a conspicuous location in their principal psychological business office, if any, and in their informed consent agreement, a notice which reads as follows. And I just wanted to kind of like comment on this issue coming up with telehealth, where if there were no offices and they are conducting the assessments via telehealth, so where the notice, this notice should be placed is, are you saying that it's in their informed consent upon testing, or
Well, I think under most circumstances, people are going to provide written informed consent to their clients, correct?
Mm-hmm. So it's going to be on the informed consent. I just wanted to clarify that.
Correct.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Okay, and any comments on, is it 29, yeah, 2960.05? Okay, well, why don't we continue on then? Let's go back to my list of sections that we're having read out. 2960.0. 2960.2. Any comments from board members? 2960.5. 2960.6. 2961, I believe is the next one. (2962) is one of the sections that we did want to have read out. Mr. Burke.
2962. A. A person whose license has been revoked, suspended, or surrendered, or who has been placed on probation may petition the board for reinstatement or modification of the penalty, including modification or termination of probation. The petition shall be on a form provided by the board and shall state any facts and information as may be required by the board, including but not limited to proof of compliance with the terms and conditions of the underlying disciplinary order. B. The petitioner may file the petition on or after the expiration of the following timeframes, each of which commences on the effective date of the decision ordering the disciplinary action, or from the date the disciplinary action is actually implemented in its entirety of the order, or any portion of it is stayed by the board itself or by the superior court. 1. 3 years for reinstatement of a license revoked or surrendered. 2. 2 years for early termination of probation or 3 years or more. 3. 2 years for modification of a condition of probation. 4. 1 year for early termination of probation of less than 3 years. C. The petitioner shall at all times have the burden of production of proof to establish by clear and convincing evidence that they are entitled to the relief sought in the petition. D. When the board itself decides upon a petition, it may consider all factors presented, including the following. 1. The offence for which the petitioner was disciplined. 2. The petitioner's rehabilitative efforts. 3. The petitioner's activities since the disciplinary action was taken. E. The board may, without affording the petitioner an opportunity to present argument, deny a petition for early termination of probation or modification of penalty for any of the following reasons. 1. The petitioner has failed to comply with the terms and conditions of the disciplinary order. 2. The board is conducting an investigation of the petitioner while they are on probation. 3. The petitioner has a subsequent arrest that is substantially related to the qualifications, functions, or duties of the licensee, and this arrest occurred while on probation. 4. The petitioner's probation with the board is currently tolled. F. For reinstatements, the board may require that the petitioner execute a form authorizing release to the board or its designee of all information concerning the petitioner's current physical and mental condition. Information provided to the board pursuant to the release shall be confidential and shall not be subject to discovery or subpoena in any other proceeding, and shall not be admissible in any action other than before the board to determine the petitioner's fitness to practice as required by Section 822. G. If the board issues an order to reinstate a license, the petitioner shall comply with 1. Fingerprint submission requirements established by the board. 2. Provisions set forth in Section 2985. 3. All terms and conditions as specified by the order.
Okay. Do we have any comments from board members on, or questions as it relates to this particular section? And there was kind of an effort made to try to systematize this so it read easily and it kind of directed the consumer or licensee in this case to. Any questions or comments? Okay. Section 2964, I think we're also going to have you read out, Mr.
2964. Whenever the board revokes or reinstates a license, it shall report the action to the National Practitioner Data Bank.
There you go. Which is just a kind of a, I think it's a substantive change in our procedure, if I'm correct, Ms. Sorick.
Can you repeat that one more time, Dr. Phillips?
But with the change in the reporting system, I believe, and reporting to all other state psychology licensing boards, we report to the National Data Practitioner Bank, correct?
Correct.
And that's just bringing the regulation in conformity with current practice.
Correct.
Okay.
Do you have something to say?
Yeah, this is Dr. Harpsheets. In 2964.3, where we've crossed out or registration, I wonder if we should not cross that out because when we in the
We haven't reached 2964.3. Let's just finish. Sorry.
Sorry.
Any comments from board members on 2964? Moving to item number 2964.3, I would agree with Dr. Harpsheets that given the changes that we've made, we should remove the strikeout on the words or registration. Make note of that, Mr. Gage. It would be appreciated.
Actually, since Mr. Gage is in the document right now, if there is agreement from the board about that, and I will defer to Ms. Bond about this procedurally, but if there isn't any opposition to that, we could just unstrike it and continue on with the next section. If we need to go back to this, we can, but since this is existing language, I want to be able to make changes to this document, and then Mr. Gage can send that document to management so that we can make sure we have a clean copy with the changes.
Are you
from
comfortable
today.
with that, Ms. Bond?
Yeah, I think as long as I understand, practically speaking, that would work for this change. I think my only concern is the idea of how this is as a global change. I just want to make sure we're clear on the board's intent, because as I've understood it, this sort of came out of the discussion from the regs that said, in this regulation over here, we don't want to change our definition of licensee versus registrant. And so out of that discussion about regs, we're now saying in all the statutes, we also want to retain those. I wasn't sure. I know I think the board made it clear for that reg. And I guess I'm just a little concerned about the impact on a global, because I'm seeing snippets, right, of the documents. So I am a little concerned about the impact on of the change globally. And maybe we want to evaluate that first.
Given that the Business and Professions Code does define licensee to include the licensed individual and a registrant?
Yeah, I think that's right as well. So I'd like a chance to further evaluate how this should be impacted by your previous decision about the regulation, if that makes sense.
It does make sense. How would we handle this procedurally, Ms. Sorick?
In the past, when we've gone through language changes, if there's been a general consensus, what we've done is to do a motion at the very end once there's been consensus for each section. So that's why I suggested perhaps we do that, but I understand Ms. Bond's concern, although it is existing language. So I will defer to Ms. Bond on the procedure for this.
Let's see, I think, so if you're going to handle all the statutes together as one, and at that point, you could direct staff to make it consistent, whether it's licensure or registration?
Yes.
that might be the best way to do it. And I totally take your point, Ms. Sork, about how it's already existing language. But how do I formulate this thought right? But if this one is sort of undone and we say, hey, this one's already existing language, let's leave it. I'm concerned about the others that aren't existing language and so are already kind of in limbo about whether we've included this or not. Please let me know if I'm missing something though about the, because I think I saw another one that we didn't bring up verbally, but a few sections back, we also had another one that I think it must have also struck registration. And based on that very first section we talked about, I just thought we'd look at them all together and make sure that whichever way the board is going, that it's consistent.
I believe it's the consensus of the board at this point, based on the discussion about the regulatory sections we were discussing earlier related to continuing professional development, that the board would prefer for there to be a distinction made between a licensed psychologist and a registrant in a way that was evident to the consumer in reading either the statutes or the regulations. So perhaps we can have that discussion at the tail end of this.
Yeah, I think if that's the case, then I'd like to be assured that the board has that same intention for these statutes that it may have expressed for those regs.
Okay.
And then we can go from there. Okay.
So maybe we can have that discussion right when we get to the end of the statutes, and then to the extent that somebody wants to make a motion to find an author to adopt these, we certainly can make that motion, and then there will be room for public comment as well, obviously.
Okay, yeah.
Okay, thanks. And the next section would be 2964.5. Does not need to be read. Are there any comments or questions from the board? None. Let's go to 2964.6. Any questions, comments by board members? Moving on to 2966 then. Are there any issues or concerns that were raised with board members they would like to discuss now? Let's continue on to the next section, please. That's 2969, which we actually are going to read out. And again, we're using the word licensee is there. So that is subject to the discussion we've already had. We'll continue, we'll have at the end of this section. Could you read that out, Mr. Burke?
Yes. 2969. A licensee shall a licensee shall 1. Attend and participate in an interview requested by the board when that licensee is under investigation no later than 60 days after receipt of notice from the board. In the absence of good cause, failure of the licensee to comply with this shall be considered unprofessional conduct and constitutes grounds for discipline of their license. 2. Produce client records pursuant to either 1. A request from the board when accompanied by that client's written authorization for release of records to the board within 15 days of receipt of the request, or 2. A court order issued in the enforcement of a subpoena mandating the release of records to the board unless it is determined that the order is unlawful or invalid. In the absence of good cause, failure to produce such records to the board subjects the licensee to a civil penalty of $1,000 per day for each day that the record documents have not been produced, after the 15th day of receiving the request and authorization, or after the date by which the court order requires the records documents to be produced, and not to exceed $5,000. The amount of the penalty shall be added to the licensee's renewal fee if it is not paid by the next succeeding renewal date. B. A healthcare facility shall produce client records pursuant to either 1. A request from the board when accompanied by that client's written authorization for release of records to the board together with a notice citing this section and describing the penalties for failure to comply with this section within 30 days of receiving the request, authorization, and notice. The board shall pay the reasonable costs of copying the medical records. This paragraph shall not require healthcare facilities to assist the board in obtaining the client's authorization, or 2. A court order issued in the enforcement of a subpoena mandating the release of records to the board, unless it is determined that the order is unlawful or invalid. In the absence of good cause, failure to produce such records to the board shall subject the healthcare facility to a civil penalty payable to the board of up to $1,000 per day for each day that the document records have not been produced. After the 30th day of receiving the request, authorization, and notice, or after the date by which the court order requires the records documents to be produced, up to $10,000. C. Multiple acts or omissions in violation of this section shall be considered grounds for disciplinary action with respect to licensure, including suspension or revocation of the license or certificate, and shall be a misdemeanor punishable as follows. 1. For a licensee, by a fine not to exceed $5,000, or 2. By imprisonment in a county jail not exceeding 6 months, or 3. By both that fine and imprisonment. 2. For a healthcare facility, by a fine not to exceed $5,000, and 2. That healthcare facility shall be reported to the State Department of Health Services, State Department of Public Health. D. Any statute of limitations applicable to the filing of an accusation by the board is tolled until the licensee or healthcare facility complies with this section and until resolution of any related appeals. E. Any civil penalties authorized by this section shall be imposed in accordance with the Administrative Procedure Act, Chapter 5, commencing with Section 11500 of Division 3 of Title 2 of the Government Code. F. For purposes of this section, healthcare facility means a clinic or health facility licensed or exempt from licensure pursuant to Division 2, commencing with Section 1200 of the Health and Safety Code. Believe that's the section.
I'm muted. I was again having a conversation with myself, apparently. Ms. Sork, what was the genesis of this particular section? You can recall.
The genesis of this section, as I remember it, was to just reorganize this section to just be more fluid with the order of things. So it's literally, it's not substantive in the actual text or changes to the amounts of the fines or what we're requiring. It was just a matter of reorganizing what we needed and when. So that was purely the change here. And that was thanks to the efforts of Ms. Bond for helping us put it in more of an order of events.
Great. I did have a couple of small comments on the text, and I'll open it up for discussion. There's a point in here where we said, on line 42 of 13 of the hand carry, I guess it was a hand carry. It says the day for each day that the records documents have not been produced. Was that do we intend to say both those words? On?
I think that may have been a typo, so to speak, a word left in there. Even the version I'm looking at separately doesn't have that. So it may have been, some remnant of the strike through.
Yeah.
And what we could do is use the most, the word we use more, which I think is records. So I think we would strike documents.
Okay, so strike documents.
Yeah, thanks for the catch.
So if you could do that, Mr. Gage, I would appreciate it. The other thing that I noticed small, is at line 33 on page 14, C1 sub 2. It says that healthcare facilities should be reported to the State Department of Health Services, State Department of Public Health. Should there be a period there? Not on the copy that I'm working.
Yeah, that could work.
I think this was another possible miss as well when we went through a check change. I think it's that healthcare facility shall be reported to the State Department of Public Health.
So we should strike the State Department of Health Services.
Yes, and we can double check the agency name on that.
Okay. Those are the only comments I had. Are there comments from board members on this particular section?
Dr. Phillips, if I can, there was one more instance under B2 where it had documents and records. There it is right there. On line 17, $1,000 per day for each day that there you go. Perfect. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Are there any comments from board members on this particular section? Okay. Why don't we move on to the next section? To read out or not? 2971. Any comments or questions from board members? None. 2985. Comments or questions from board members? Am I lulling you guys to sleep? And section 2986, if you could read that out, Mr. Berg.
2986. A psychology license is void if not renewed within 3 years from the expiration date. Once void, the board cannot restore or reissue that license. The person who held that license may apply for and obtain a new license if they meet the requirements of this chapter, provided that they A. have not committed any acts or crimes constituting grounds for denial of a license. B. establish to the satisfaction of the board that they are qualified to practice psychology. C. pay all required fees.
Thank you very much. Are there any comments on this particular section? Okay, hearing none. As Ms. Bond requested, we should have a brief discussion. Is it the consensus of the board? Let me put it to you this way. Is there anyone on the board that disagrees with the idea of making the distinction between licensee and registered psychological assistant or associate? So a difference between a licensee and a registrant. I think that was the consensus of the board from the last, but I'm just double checking. Any dissent? Hearing none, I think it's fair to say, Ms. Vaughn, unless you want us to take a motion and take a poll of the group, that we've answered that question for you.
Yeah, I think so. So that we will treat it as a global change to be more specific, to specify the distinction between licensee and registrant in every instance, to express what we mean. And then, okay, and that's also in line with the previous regulatory discussion. So you're gonna end up with more specifics, which is generally a good thing.
Okay.
We just wanna make sure to absolutely catch every instance of it because we don't want the argument made that, well, you didn't put it here, so you must not have meant registrant. But it does allow the board to be more specific about what it means in each case. So I think that approach is fine.
Great.
Thanks.
And despite the fact I thought there was a certain elegance to the word licensee, just using licensee for everybody, I certainly can appreciate from the point of view of consumers, supervisors, psychological assistants or associates, this will perhaps be a little bit more understandable to them and therefore user-friendly. Okay, so unless there's any additional comments with respect to this particular, these particular sections, is there a motion by anyone? And then we'll go to
Dr. Phillips, I would like to move that the board approve the Enforcement Committee's recommended changes to the Business and Professions Code sections related to enforcement, to delegate to staff to make any technical and non-substantive changes based on today's discussion, and then direct staff to seek an author for the proposed language.
And I'll second that motion. This is
Thank
Leah
you.
Tate.
Thank you. Is there any further board discussion? Well, why don't we go to public comment? Ms. Moderator, if you'd be kind enough to open the public comment box.
This is the moderator, and at the direction of the board, I have opened up the Q&A feature for public comment. Members of the public, if you would like to make a comment on this item, please click that Q&A icon located at the bottom right-hand corner of your WebEx screen. And it looks like we have a request for comment from Dr. Winkleman. One moment while I request to unmute.
Hello, it's Dr. Elizabeth Winkleman again from CPA. I just want to thank the staff and the committee for work again on streamlining these statutes and for also for considering incorporating the issues that were discussed about licensee and registrants and clarifying that. I really appreciate it. I just had one section I wanted to comment on, which is the proposed changes to 2912.
You could scroll down to that.
Okay, and this is CPA as the organization does not have a position on this issue. We have not considered it, but I do a lot of I've done a lot of work and written on interstate practice, and I just had a couple of issues that I wanted to raise for the board's consideration. So one is typically a temporary license provision is the understanding is in place so that people who have started their therapy, say in another state, can have some transition time if they're going to be spending significant time or moving into a new state. So a 30-day, like a 1-month period would give enough transition time, in other words, in most cases for that patient to make a transition. The other side of it, so on the one hand, there's the positives to the patient of having more flexibility by, for example, making it non-consecutive 30 days. But the flip side of that is the patient protection side, which is that if it were non-consecutive 30 days, that's kind of close to, I don't want this to sound bad, it's kind of close to a free pass, let's say, because it would allow 7.5 months of weekly therapy or a full year of biweekly therapy to be provided by somebody who's not licensed in California and it's a little bit mushy, unclear how the board would, it would be giving up some regulatory control potentially over that psychologist who would be providing services to a patient in California. And I also wanted to mention is that if the board did change this to 30, or it would be legislation, sorry, if the legislation did change it to 30 non-consecutive days, I believe it would be among the 3 most lenient states in all of the US in terms of temporary practice laws. I reviewed APA 50-state chart, and only Alabama and Georgia allow unrestricted I believe, and if it's a couple years out of date, and maybe I missed one, but I believe that only Alabama and Georgia currently allow 30 non-consecutive days per year without any kind of registration with the other state's board or any other certificate like an interjurisdictional practice certificate or a SIPACT. Most states maybe allow maybe 2 weeks or 15 days and many also require registration for out-of-state license with the board. And then and some states don't allow any practice from the out-of-state, or they only allow it from the neighboring states that are contiguous. So I just wanted to raise that issue. As I said, I just feel like it deserves a little more discussion in terms of whether that change is better for consumers, worse for consumers. What would the impact really be in terms of protecting consumers, and then also the regulators' ability to have power over the practice that's happening in California?
I think you've raised a really interesting question.
Dr. Phillips, can I
Can I finish my comment first?
Oh, sorry. Go on.
Okay. I think you raise a really interesting question, Dr. Winkleman. Typically, I'm used to you arguing in terms of continuity of access to care. So I feel like we find ourselves on the opposite side of the issue again. But I think it is an interesting question and one that we should probably discuss as a board. I'm sorry, Dr. Kasuga, could you go ahead?
Sorry, I didn't know that you were making a comment, but
that's okay.
Thank you so much. It's really hard to when you can see cues among people. I just wanted to point out that psychological services does not just like include therapy. There's also assessments, and I've also done some interstate practice previously, and it's really helpful to be able to do non-consecutive in terms of assessment. So it's not just like I understand your concerns about non-consecutive therapy provisions, but there's also other types of psychological services that like a 30-day non-consecutive practice would be kind of like completely fine.
There's also a question of clinical judgment in here too. The psychologists make a clinical judgment whether it's appropriate to work with somebody at such a distance for an extended period of time. But I understand what the concern is.
This is Dr. Harbsheets. I just want to give a bit of history that this isn't necessarily a change. I think maybe a couple of years ago, it was when Dr. Horn was still chairing the licensure committee. We looked at the way that this was written, and it was confusing because it didn't say consecutive or non-consecutive, but the way it was written, one could interpret it either way. And what's happening here, I think, is just clarifying that. So I wanted to just say it's not a wholesale change. It's just clarifying something that's been there for however long, quite some time.
And that's consistent with my recollection too.
Okay.
From prior membership on the licensure committee, that this is how staff had been interpreting, and maybe Mr. Glass-Steagall or Ms. Junkin correct me on this, but this is the way it had been interpreted by staff, but we wanted to bring that interpretation, make it clearer what the interpretation was so that there was no question. Ms. Glass-Steagall or Ms.
You are correct, Dr. Phillips.
Okay.
Yes, that's my recollection as well. Thank you.
May I add another comment?
Sure.
So yes, I wanted to mention that I had heard that was the interpretation as well. However, my understanding is this was rejected as a substantive change. And that's why it wasn't part of the sunset review. So that although it had been interpreted that way, the usual construction of the word a period of is consecutive. So I understand the historical background, but I still think it's just worth considering. And Dr. Phillips, I'm not taking a position on one side or another. I just feel like it's something that's important to consider. And in terms of the trends that are happening, I think it needs to be considered also in the context of what the trends, or it's worth considering, and worth considering how this fits in with the way the rest of the country is going. And that, as we've discussed on previous items, we can't control what other states are going to do. So this is basically giving a lot of flexibility for people to come into California and practice. Whereas, of course, we don't control what other states do, but 48 other states are not so generous in how they have viewed this. And the trend is obviously for SciPac, but that's a totally other issue that we're not going to go through. But they also have a separate registration and qualifications that, of course, we have issues with that. So it is very complex, and I just ask that it be considered, and perhaps if it's going to be 30 non-consecutive days, perhaps the out-of-state psychologist might need to register with the Board of Psychology. That's a pretty common practice in other states, particularly ones that have longer temporary practice laws. So I'm just raising these as issues for consideration. I'm not taking a position.
Absolutely.
Pros and cons. There's pros and cons. I can see them both.
Yeah. Ms. Sorek or Ms. Chung, do you want to weigh in on this particular issue?
This is Antoinette. I'll just reiterate what was mentioned earlier insofar as this is the way we have interpreted this section, and we have received several calls from individuals that want to make sure they're doing the right thing in practicing here in continuity of care circumstances. So we just wanted to make the language very clear. And as was mentioned by Dr. Winkleman, it was a substantive change that was rejected as part of Sunset, but it doesn't make it impossible for us to include it in a legislative proposal. And at the end of the day, whether this language were to move forward or not, it would still be the interpretation of the staff as it has been for several years that it doesn't have to be consecutive days. So this was just a matter of, I guess, making it more clear and transparent in the language with our practice.
If I remember, Ms. Sorek, this was during the period of time where they would really only allow for cleanup in the sunset, when they did the sunset legislation. Is that correct?
No, I mean, I think there was just a question of how this works in operation and practicality, and yeah.
Okay. Because I know there was a period where they weren't taking very much in the way of anything into sunset, and then it became more liberal-minded about it. But so this is consistent with the way that the board has been conducting itself. Is there any discussion among board members with regard to this particular issue or concerns they want to raise?
Dr. Phillips?
Yes.
This is not board comment, this is board counsel, but a quick thought, it occurs to me that if this were read the other way, if staff were interpreting this to say that somebody couldn't practice for 30 consecutive days, then that could actually be more allowing, because anytime they're under 30 days in a calendar year consecutively, then that would not cause a problem. And then theoretically they could have another 30 days, or excuse me, another less than 30 days and not. So I think, I mean, I'm just sort of playing out that other scenario in the language. I think it doesn't lend itself well to what staff would be doing anyway. That makes sense.
I mean, if we were to change back the language and not either, and not say consecutive or non-consecutive?
Right. I mean, well, the current language is just sort of stated in a more vague way, and so this just provides the clarity to that. But then, if for some reason it were to be interpreted the opposite, to say only consecutive days, I think that would actually cause some more problems anyway.
Dr. Phillips, this is Sayron here. I think what I'm hearing is perhaps, if based on what Ms. Bond has just said, I think a line about that the cumulative days should not exceed 30 days in a year, in a year. So that you can only do, if I'm understanding correctly, you can do 15 days consecutive and then the remainder 15 days non-consecutive. So in total, no more than 30 in a given year. Is that accurate? Is that reflective of the intent?
I think that's also what the language says.
Right.
No more
Right. I see what you're
days.
saying. Yes. The idea is that after that, you're done.
I think the point Dr. Winkleman was making, though, is that somebody could come in and say, well, I'm going to see this person every week. And that would give them, I think she said 7.5 months of working with someone, an out-of-state psychologist working with a California resident for 7.5 months, using the 30 days non-consecutive. I could see somebody once a week for 7 months plus. And that was, if I'm remembering correctly, that was the point she was making. Are we comfortable with that?
Right. Are you comfortable with that, Dr. Harpsheets?
I haven't heard any problems, so I am comfortable with it at this point in time, but I think it's something worth paying attention to as we move forward. We have been applying it that way for some time now, and it hasn't seemed to be a problem.
Yeah. Ms. Chiang, has this become to your knowledge, has this become a problem?
I have not come across any problem thus far regarding this 30-day temporary practice.
Other than confusion about what the 30 days are?
Correct. That's the only question that we have received.
Okay. Is there any more public comment?
This is the moderator. Yes, we have a request for public comment from Dr. Schaefer.
Okay.
Hi, everyone. It's Melody from KPIC and Division 2. I'm just wondering if the board has thought about 30 days over a course of a year, given vacations and people being ill and what have you, how someone could provide service over an entire year and based on what it says here, within any calendar year, could have continued years of service they're giving a patient and not be licensed within our state, or as they do in New York and other states, even submit any paperwork for approval to do so. New York, for example, because with having students that move to college and such, I've had to check this out myself in various states. They have a mandate where you apply with some paperwork that they have, and then you have X amount of days, which are not extensive, to be used in a limited amount of time. I think it's like 2 months or something like that. That makes sense for transition. Otherwise, the way this is stated, it's really opening up for people to set up their practices and kind of getting around having to be vetted in any way. So I see that as a concern, but I'm not sure if the board sees that as a concern.
Well, I don't know if it's really become a practical concern that that's actually what's happening.
Not yet.
I think
no.
we can imagine a variety. Well, this is not changing the statute in terms of the 30 days, nor is it changing the staff's interpretation of the statute. So I'm not hearing from staff, unless I'm misunderstanding, and staff can certainly correct me, that type of situation has arisen where.
How would it may be written somewhere and maybe I haven't seen it. How would the board know that anything did happen in terms of using this regulation? In other words, is a psychologist from another state using this regulation to provide service here? Do they then report to the board in some way so the board even knows that this is going on with this individual?
Well, I think that, if we could ask the enforcement unit if they've heard anything. It sounds like the licensing unit has not heard any kind of complaint, or that would be, say, the client calling and making a complaint, not realizing that we don't have jurisdiction over the out-of-state practitioner. But it would be a good question for the enforcement unit. And I don't know if anyone's here who could answer that for us. Maybe Ms. Sorek might know.
While we're waiting for Ms. Sorek to come online, it's my understanding from talking to Ms. Monterrubio that this is not problematic from her point of view, and that has not been problematic. She sat through all these committee meetings where we discussed this, and didn't express any particular concerns about situations coming up. The way we typically become aware of this is either through questions from out-of-state practitioners, which would typically go to the Central Services Unit or licensing, I assume, or a complaint from a consumer about some kind of conduct.
Sure, and as a practitioner, I would not have known of how other states are functioning in this way unless I had to engage in the same for short transitions of patients who are moving out of state. But there are so many that won't allow any service whatsoever, not even one day. And we truly are a rigorous outlier, let's say, on this method. And my concern would be someone from out of state, they don't know the services within the area in which the patient is living and that they're treating, and they could veritably see this patient for year after year after year without ever being licensed in the state. Something about it just seems a little offish to me, and it's great that nothing bad has happened, that there's been no incident, but I'm more, my pragmatism is build it first in some way so that you ward against something happening, not waiting until something happens and then having to realize maybe there was another way. So
well, let's put this in a realistic context too. You are now suggesting that we add another mechanism to licensure where we're already lagging behind and trying to get things processed when we know of no problem.
No, actually, I'm not suggesting any limits to licensure. This is not someone being licensed in the state. It's just 30 days.
You understand, but this was another function that the licensing department would have to do, which is already shorthanded. And we're doing it in response to something where it has not created any problems that were brought to the attention of the board.
Sure, there's other things that we've spoken about today that there's not a problem yet to happen, yet putting heads together on what could improve something is the intent.
And I'm
not going to belabor the point. I've shared my opinion, and it's just my opinion, my thoughts on it, and I'm going to pull myself out of the situation now with respect to the committee carrying on its work, or the board rather.
I appreciate that, Ms. Schaefer. Thank you for your
Dr. Schaefer.
Dr. Schaefer, excuse me.
Thank you.
I've been giving people doctorates and taking them away. I don't know what's going
on. Oh, wow. Interesting comment.
Apparently, I'm a degree-granting institution. So, all this being the case, are there additional questions or comments that the board have about this particular section?
This is the moderator. We do have another request for public comment.
Good. Okay, certainly, absolutely.
From Jolinder Crow, I'll request to unmute her microphone.
Okay.
Yes. Well, you've heard some of the concerns and thoughts about this. I'm actually more curious about what the rationale is for this. By the way, I don't think you would know if this was an issue. It's probably not an issue because it's so lenient that I don't know why anybody would complain. But I am curious, and I know it's been this way for a while, what is the rationale for making California maybe the most lenient state about temporary practice in the country?
Well, I think part of it is a consideration of continuity of services, so that the example often used by CPA is the the student that goes away to college. It's continuity of care. They may have an eating disorder. They don't want to change the therapeutic relationship, and this allows them to have some continuity of care while they're out of state.
Well, I see that. I'm just sort of curious because when we talk about SIPACT or other things like that, one of the things that this board has always talked about is wanting to maintain pretty significant control over the people who are licensed in the state or providing services in the state.
Mm-hmm.
So in some ways, this doesn't seem particularly consistent with that. I agree. I can see, you know, what if somebody is a student, or what if somebody wants to see a specialist from out of state. It's just that it doesn't quite match up with the stated desire over many years of this board to want to maintain pretty strict standards over who deliver services to consumers. So,
I hear what you're saying.
you know, that's the thing that sort of sticks. I think that's the thing that sort of boggles the argument, you know, makes it a sticky argument, because it doesn't seem like that it's consistent. It's consistent with what the board has been doing for years and years, but it's not particularly consistent conceptually with wanting to maintain the highest standard of service delivery to consumers in California.
Understood.
Dr. Phillips, can I respond again?
Can we wait can I see if there's any more public comment, then I'll let you respond?
Okay.
Okay. Is there any further public comment?
This is the moderator. Appears there are no further comments or requests for comment. Would you like me to close that Q&A panel?
Please. And now Dr. Kasuga.
Thank you, Dr. Phillips. And I just wanted to comment that, of course, like, you know, the Board of Psychology in California is doing things for our for the consumer protection of Californians, and doesn't really bother itself that much with other states. But I also not quite sure that the practice is necessarily one of the most lenient, because I know of a lot of other states that also has 30-day out-of-state practice that's not consecutive, such as Texas. So I'm, you know, not really. I just wanted to kind of like put that out there, that I think that there's definitely utility to having this for continuity of care, as Dr. Phillips has pointed out. But I also don't see this as a problem, as stated by board staff thus far. Thank you.
Thank you. Does anyone want to discuss section 2912 further on the board? I think I'm seeing any hands go up. Speaking. So there being no further discussion, is there any further discussion about any of the remainder of the sections? Okay, well, there's been a motion and a second, and there's been consensus with regard to the uses of the word licensee and registrant. So Ms. Berteau, if you could call the roll, the motion.
Sure. Kasuga.
Aye.
Cervantes.
Aye.
Fu.
Aye.
Harbsheets.
Aye.
Nystrom.
Aye.
Phillips.
Aye.
Riscate.
Aye.
Rogers.
Aye.
Tate.
Aye.
Thank you.
Madam President, I wanted to get some clarification. Are we continuing till 4 o'clock? Are we continuing till 5 o'clock?
I believe the way we're going, 5 o'clock, I think, would give us enough time to complete everything.
Okay, so that would mean not taking up the regulations today, I assume, which is what I've been told ahead of today.
Okay.
Or do you want to take up the regulations, Ms. Sorick?
I would suggest if the board is going to go until 5 to continue with the work of the regulations, and then the other 2 items on the agenda were update items. So if we are not able to get to those items, they aren't for a board vote. So whatever the will of the board is, but if we are going to go till 5, I would suggest we continue with the work.
Great. Then I will go on to the second part of number 24 to the document. So the second part of this is a regulatory update, report, and consideration of possible action on committee recommendations. Again, this had its genesis in the same way that the legislative materials did. I think we probably may run into the words licensee and registrant here. Hearing no protests, I'll assume that we're going to make any and all of the same changes to make them consistent with our discussions earlier today and the discussions with regard to regulations. There have been no changes in the since the committee meeting with regard to any of the items that we have in the regulations. So unless there's a specific item that a board member would like to have read out, I just put them before you as a whole and ask if there is any comments or questions that people have about these proposed regulatory changes. The wrong screen. I don't see any comments from board members. I think what we're looking for here with regard to these regulations, before we open it up for public comment, is 2 separate motions. One would be that the board recommendation of approve the committee's recommended changes to CCR sections related to enforcement and begin the rulemaking process, and to designate to the executive officer to make any technical non-substantive changes. Would anyone like to make that motion?
Dr. Hart.
So move. This is Leah Tate.
Okay, seconded, Dr. Harpsheets.
Okay, thank you very much. And there would be a second. Can we make the second motion now, Ms. Bond, or do we have to wait till we voted on the first motion?
Pardon me, finding the mute button. Which would be the second motion?
The second would be if no relevant adverse comments are received during the 45-day comment period on any requested hearing, authorize the executive officer to take all necessary steps to complete.
So now I'm going to allow your reg counsel to jump in here because we're in regulatory territory.
Oh, sorry. I'm sorry, Ms. Hogan.
Thanks.
And Ms. Bond.
No worries. I would say that could all be one motion. It's just
Okay.
2 sentences. And if you want to add and direct staff to make the comments, conforming changes with licensee and registrant as discussed in this board meeting today, that would also go in the same motion.
Okay. Anybody want to make, I'm going to ask the person that made Dr. Tate if you'd withdraw the motion and remake the motion.
I'll withdraw the motion, remake the motion, and align my words with Ms. Hoganson regarding staff.
And I will second it.
Very good. Thank you very much. Is there any further board discussion before we open for public comment? Okay. Hearing any or seeing any. So if, Madam Moderator, if you'd be kind enough to open the public comment.
This is the moderator, and at the direction of the board, I've opened up the Q&A feature for public comment. Members of the public, if you would like to make a comment on this item, please click that Q&A icon located at the bottom right-hand corner of your WebEx screen. And it looks like we have a request from Dr. Winkleman. One moment while I request to unmute.
Hi, thanks, Elizabeth Winkleman again. So I have comments on 3 parts of these regulations. but two of them are really brief. So the first one is this first section, 1380.6. So my question about this is it makes it sound like the psychological associates can have their own advertising, whereas that would be inconsistent with the psychological associate FAQs on the board website. And also just my understanding is they cannot have their own advertising. And so I just find that including them in this section about advertising is confusing. I think it would be easy if I just make the other comments as well too, and then instead of one by one, if that's okay.
Sure.
The other is on 1396 about the ethical principles and code of conduct.
If we could go to item, Mr. Gage.
I'm sorry, you said a
1396.
Oh, 1396, thank you.
Right. So I would just suggest you may want to consider striking the adopted August 21st and effective 2017 part. You might want to consider that because the APA is currently working on a revision, and I'm sure it's going to take quite a long time still, but I don't think you're going to want to have to redo, any regulatory process when APA does update the code. And I believe that in the other section 2936 or 2960, I don't believe there's a specific adoption date in those statutes. So anyway, just something to consider.
Let's pause there for a second so that we can Ms. Hoganson's response to that particular thing. Is it necessary, Ms. Hoganson?
Generally, unlike legislation that can do whatever the heck it wants, regulations, if you are referring to something, it is preferred to include any dates so that the public is 100% sure they're looking at the correct version. However, there are exceptions, and I can look into that if the board would like, but generally speaking, the preference is to have it dated.
I thought there was a difference with regulations and statutes, but I wasn't sure.
And if they did update it, because the legislature does require the board to use the APA code of conduct, it would be a simple non-substantive change, I believe.
So it would be a shorter regulatory process?
Right, not a formal notice and hearing process, but a non-substantive change called a Section 100.
Okay, and I'm sorry I interrupted you, Dr. Winkleman. You had a third section you were concerned about.
No, that's fine. That's very helpful to know that if that it would not be a long process to change it if needed. And then my third comment is just about 1396.3 about test security. And it's proposed to be deleted.
Correct.
From my reading through the other proposed changes, it seems like that was just not wanting to kind of repeat things that are already included in the ethics code. But the 1396.3 actually is stronger protection for test security slightly than the ethics code. So I just wanted to know to raise a question as to whether why is that being deleted and the intent, and whether that might reduce the protections against the release of testing materials, because I know that psychologists do sometimes cite this as part of the rationale for not releasing protected test materials and protecting their validity and security. So those are my three comments.
Okay, and as to your last comment, my understanding we were taking this section out because it is on some level duplicative of what's in the ethics code, We're deferring to the ethics code as being the standard that has been developed within the profession. To raise an interesting is that your understanding as well, Ms. Sork, as to why we head out?
Yes, that's exactly my recollection was that when there were items that were covered in the ethics code where there was duplication, we removed the language from our regulations because our regulations incorporate the ethical code by reference. So we felt that this was duplicative, but what I'm hearing Dr. Winkleman say is that this goes a little above and beyond what's specified in the ethical code.
Which is not necessarily a bad thing.
Right.
Yeah. So we may want to consider not striking that through that particular section. Is there any, I'm going to ask the board to discuss that particular subject. We'll go back to public comment in a second.
Great, thank you. Thank you.
Sure. Is there a sentiment among board members as it relates to 1396.3?
This is Dr. Hardsheets. I could see, since it is more detailed than the ethics code, that it could be useful when a psychologist is getting pressured, say from an attorney, to provide psychological test information. So I would support keeping it in.
I'm similarly minded. I also think it's to the benefit of consumers, because when test security is compromised, effectiveness of tests is compromised, which makes them less useful a tool in helping the consumer. So,
yes. Thank you for taking what I said, the next step. I appreciate that because I see it the same way.
How did the remainder of the board feel about including 1396.3? Obviously, we'll have to amend the motion if we decide to do so.
This is Dr. Tate. I'm in agreement with Dr. Harpsheets and Dr. Phillips at this time.
I support that as well.
Anyone that does not support adding it back in at this point? Okay, well, why don't we take the strike through out? I think that's a really interesting issue that Dr. Winkleman brought back. I did want to go back to Dr. Winkleman's first comment and ask Ms. Cheung. Fortunately, we don't have much in the way of enforcement staff with us. Perhaps Ms. Sorek discuss advertising by psychological assistants.
I'm trying to remember this is Antoinette, when this was brought up in particular was at a licensure committee meeting. And at the time, I believe Dr. Horn was chair. So it was some time ago. And the question was whether or not there could be independent advertising. And I think what was conveyed at the time was that there needed to be a clear clarification that if advertising was allowed, then it needed to specify that supervision was happening and by whom. And then it went to the enforcement committee, and that's where you guys kind of parsed out the details on what information we would need for consumer protection to ensure that we had all the information we needed, the client had the information they needed, and that it was clear that they couldn't independently practice or advertise on their own without some specification. That was my memory of this item.
And that's my recollection as well. And in part, this was in response to the fact that what were formerly called psychological assistants and now going to be called psychological associates were concerned that the limitations that would be placed on them if they were not allowed to advertise would prohibited them from being competitive in the marketplace, which in turn, I think, impacts consumers in terms of the price of the services they get and the availability of a variety of different services. So think we were trying to be responsive to stakeholders as well as to make sure that all the adequate checks and measures were there so that consumers would know who they were dealing with, that they were supervised, and what the identity of their supervisor was, et cetera.
My comment was actually about a different section, which was 1380.6.
If we can go up to 13806.
Because yes, I agree that currently, and it would be good to clarify that the psychologist who's the supervisor can advertise their psychological associates services. My question about 1380.6 is that it appears to say that it seems to be saying that the psychological associate can have their own separate advertising, whereas my understanding is that that would not be allowed. And the current FAQ on your website says, can a psychological associate advertise or have a website? No. The psychological associate is not licensed to practice independently. The supervisor can list the psychological associate on advertisements and or websites, as long as it's clear the person is registered, etc. So if you wanted to change it so that the psychological associate can independently advertise, then 1380.6 would make sense. If you want to maintain it as it currently is, then I think that the 1380.6 would need to be changed.
Okay.
For clarification.
I appreciate it.
Thanks.
Ms. Chiang?
Yes, Dr. Phillips.
On your bailiwick, or does this fall in the bailiwick of enforcement?
I'm sorry, would you mind repeating that?
Yeah, I'm using a really outdated term like I'm someone from the 1930s. Is this more of a question for enforcement or more of a question for licensing? These are enforcement regs.
I think we both can answer some aspects of the question, because from my reading and understanding, the two sections is a little bit different in nature. As I understand them, the other section that we're looking at for advertising is really talking about who can or how, who and how to advertise for service. And for 1380.6 is how they have to identify themselves professionally under their respective license or registration. So I am not quite seeing the conflicting connection there, but maybe that's just how I understand it as a staff person.
We have an omnibus list of things that this would apply to, and they start at line 7 through line 10. Among those are flyers, websites, etc. So I think that may be where confusion may come in. It wasn't, I don't think it was the intent behind this to allow, it was to allow psychological associates to better advertise their services. But I don't know what our thinking is collectively as to the question of whether they should be able to have their own websites, which is a slightly different thing. And typically, psychological associates are listed on the website of the supervisor. Our facility. So we need to look at this language. It's also a little fuzzy. 2 days. Any other board members have reactions?
This is Dr. Harbsheets. You know, I feel strongly that psychological associates should be able to advertise on their own, as long as they provide the information that is listed in this document. And because it does give them the opportunity to be competitive, to get their information out there. And we're also dealing with an environment where there are just not enough providers to meet the need of the public. So as long as there are these other protections in terms of identifying the supervisor, et cetera, I feel very comfortable and would encourage us to allow them to advertise.
And that would include independent websites on your end?
Yes, as long as that information about that they are under supervision and who the supervisor is and how to contact. Yes.
I do think that from the point of view of just the way that commerce is conducted in the United States anymore, that it would give them a great deal of freedom as long as they were not misrepresenting who or what they are. Other board members?
I agree with the suggestion of Dr. Harb Sheets.
I would say I would agree as well.
I think I'm in. Anyone else want to weigh in? Okay, hearing anyone. I think that addressed your comments, if I'm Coleman.
Yeah, it did. Thanks very much. And if that's the, if that's the will of the board, that is fine. I think that I also see some benefits for them to be advertising separately. It was just not my understanding that without this, that they could do so. So thank you.
It was a very clarifying discussion, and we very much appreciated the thoughtfulness of your comments. So thank you. As always, you give us an alternative voice so that we can look at what we're doing and see if we're doing it right. Are there any other commenters?
This is the moderator. It appears there are no further requests for comment. Would you like me to close that Q&A panel?
If you would, please. Is there any further board discussion based on Dr. Winkleman's comments or otherwise? Now, the motion was made before we reincorporated one section, if I remember the section it was that we reincorporated. Not very good with remembering all the numbers of these things. So, Dr. Tate, can your motion include the provision that we reincorporated into the regulations?
I'm happy to include it.
And are you comfortable?
If I might interject, it would be 1396.3.
Thank you very much. Thank you for saving myself from myself. And are you comfortable with that amendment? I didn't hear you. Maybe I missed it.
No.
Dr. Tate said yes.
Dr.
Yes,
Tate is
I'm fine with it.
Yes, and
And
this is Dr.
so are you
Harvey.
comfortable with it as a second?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. Sorry I made that confusing. Okay, so why, unless there's other board comment, why don't we call the roll, Ms. Porto?
Sure. Kasuga.
Aye.
Cervantes.
Aye.
Fu.
Aye.
Harb Sheets.
Aye.
Nystrom.
Aye.
Phillips.
Aye.
Riscate.
Aye.
Rogers.
Aye.
Tate.
Aye.
Thank you.
Okay, well, the motion passed. So we will proceed with, in due course, we will proceed with initiating those regulatory changes. I do want to give a shout out to Ms. Bond, Ms. Hoganson, board staff and board management for all the hard work that they've put into this. I've been through a few iterations of the enforcement committee, and we've been wrestling with these quite a long time. It seems to me, anyway. Everything seems to take time, but I think what we've produced has been helpful, and I think will be helpful to consumers, licensees, and others looking at our statutes and regulations. So thank you very much, and thank you for the board for considering our requests. I think that is the end of the enforcement. Is there anything else I need to bring up? I don't believe so. So I think we've covered everything we were going to talk about. So I will turn it back to Dr.
Perfect. And thank you, Dr. Phillips, for your hard work. I know that was a huge undertaking. We are going to shift to agenda item number 25. This is the update regarding the Matthews v. Becerra California Child Abuse and Neglect Reporting Act, CANRA, and mandated reporting. Ms. Sorek?
Yes, an update on this item, and that is this has been another longstanding item, and thank you for being patient with it thus far. Just an update that on December 6th, 2021, the board was notified by the Office of the Attorney General that Assemblymember Garcia had withdrawn the entirety of her request for a legal opinion on July 15th, 2021. Therefore, that opinion has been canceled. The case Matthews versus Becerra was remanded to the Los Angeles Superior Court and is scheduled to be heard on August 8th. If Assemblymember Garcia is still interested in the questions that may be affected by the Matthews litigation, she may submit a new opinion. However, she is running for another office. So the board staff is going to go ahead and submit a refreshed request to another legislator before the August case is heard. The benefit for those of you who may not be as familiar with this case, with working with the legislator, is that if a legislator makes a request for a legal opinion from the Office of the Attorney General, there isn't a payment required for that request to have the law clarified. So that is a big incentive for the board to continue with that process to seek clarification through a legislator's office. And I'm available for any questions the board might have.
If any board member has questions for Ms. Sorek?
I do. I don't know if they're questions really, Ms. Sorek, but I just thought for the benefit of our board members, I'd give a little bit more background. The CANRA, as it's now written, has created a very confusing situation for practitioners, which in turn lessens, I think, the effectiveness of the legislation in protecting consumers and people that are potentially subject to abuse of one sort or another, in this case, children. And for instance, questions have arisen as to whether sexting between teenagers constitutes something that would be covered under CANRA, and therefore, for instance, teachers, counselors, or even parents could report sexting among 17-year-olds, even though that may be fairly typical behavior. I have no opinion on it one way or the other. That just happens. And there's other areas of confusion that have been created by CANRA that we were trying to get some clarity with respect to. We've been in the process of trying to get clarity on it for a substantial period of time. Some confusion was created by the Board of Behavioral Science seeking an opinion from counsel within DCA, not our current counsel, not our former counsel, but their own counsel, and receiving an opinion, a definitive opinion, which we feel uncomfortable acting upon because it has not been. It's arguable one way or the other. What that has left is our licensees with confusion as to what the statute means and whether they would be complaint could arguably be brought against them for reporting or not reporting in systems. So we are very much desirous of getting this clarity as to what CANRA means. This is the most efficient way for us to get it, but unfortunately this has been going on. How many years now, Ms. Sorek?
Since 2015.
Oh, God. As so many things have come up within the context of this meeting, the wheels of government grind slow sometimes. And And I know that it's been a source of frustration on the part of the Psychological Association as well as board members. We've been unable to give a definitive guidance on this, so I will just stop it there. Hopefully we will get some clarity here pretty soon.
Thanks for the background, Dr. Phillips. Any other board members with comments or questions? Dr. Phillips, is that your hand again, or? I'm going to assume it's from before. Ms. Moderator, can you please open up public comment?
This is the moderator, and at the direction of the board, I've opened up the Q&A feature for public comment. Members of the public, if you would like to make a comment on this item, please click that Q&A icon located at the bottom right-hand corner of your WebEx screen. I'll go ahead and pause a moment to allow the public time to access the Q&A panel and submit their requests. All right, and seeing none, would you like me to close that Q&A panel?
That would be perfect. Thank you so much. And we are moving on to agenda item number 26, the Budget Committee update. Dr. Rogers is the chairperson of the Budget Committee, and Dr. Rogers, take it away.
Good afternoon, everyone. We have recently formed the Budget Ad Hoc Committee, which consists of myself and Ms. Julie Nystrom. We met on January 26th, where we learned about some options for right-sizing the budget. So I would just like to say thank you to the staff for all of their hard work, their incredibly thorough analysis and thoughtfulness in exploring some different options for trying to right-size the budget. I'm also thankful to Ms. Nystrom for serving on the committee alongside me, and I appreciate her thoughtful and insightful comments and questions as we had our discussion on January 26th. And I look forward to continuing to have a robust discussion about how to make corrections to the budget. Thank you.
Does any board member have questions or comments for Dr. Rogers at this time? I do not see any hands. Ms. Moderator, can you please open up public comment?
This is the moderator, and at the direction of the board, I have opened up the Q&A panel for public comment. Members of the public, if you would like to make a comment on this item, please click that Q&A icon located at the bottom right-hand corner of your WebEx screen. I'll pause a moment to allow the public time to access the Q&A panel and submit their requests. All right, seeing none, would you like me to close that Q&A panel?
Yes, please, and thank you very much. We are moving on to agenda item number 27, and these is recommendations for agenda items for future board meetings. If any board member has a suggestion or recommendation, this is your time.
Dr. Tate, I'm sorry. Could we just go back to item 26 briefly? I just wanted to also notify everyone that we'll be having a public stakeholder meeting on February 25th, which is next Friday. So I wanted to apprise the board of that as well.
Oh, thank you. I saw that on there, but I missed the data for that. But thank you for giving us the date. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Okay, again, I'm asking if any board members have a recommendation for agenda items for future board meetings.
Dr. Tate?
Yes.
This is Dr. Kasuga. I wanted to add to the agenda for an ASPPB update on the board of directors meeting on the APPP2. So I just want them to share a status update for us.
Perfect. That's a very good suggestion.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Thanks, Dr. Kasuga. Let me open this up for public comment. Ms. Moderator, can you open up public comment?
This is the moderator, and at the direction of the board, I have opened up the Q&A panel for public comment. Members of the public, if you would like to make a comment on this item, please click that Q&A icon located at the bottom right-hand corner of your WebEx screen. I'll pause a moment to allow the public time to access the Q&A panel and submit their requests. All right, seeing none, would you like me to close that Q&A panel?
Yes, and thank you for all of your help.
Dr. Tate?
So that brings us to the end of, yes.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
I don't know if actually, I just wanted to say that I really enjoyed the mindfulness exercise that Dr. Rogers led us this board meeting, and I don't know if she's still willing to do it as well for the next meeting, but I'm hoping that that can be done at the next meeting as well if it's amenable to everybody.
I think that many people enjoy the mindfulness exercise. So I think we're just going to put Dr. Rogers on there, and she'll just have to know she needs to be ready for April.
My favorite.
Thanks for the support.
Yes. Thank you so much, Dr. Kasuga and Dr. Tate. My favorite phrase to use on the board is "I stand ready to serve." So I'm happy to do that at the next board meeting. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you. So this brings us to the end of our two-day board meeting. Thanks for everyone for attending and pushing through our long two-day meeting. All I need is a motion to adjourn, please.
So moved.
I don't think we need to second that. I don't believe. But thank you to everyone and to the public and the board members. And I hope everyone has a great weekend. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Thank you, everyone.
Great job, Madam President.
Fantastic work.